Shabbat Shalom. At the end of last week's Parshat, we began reading a section of Torah, which for me is one of the most difficult parts of the Torah. And it's interesting to me also that the Torah ends the Parsha in the middle of that account and saves the conclusion for this week. I'm not sure what is trying to be said, if anything, by separating the story from its conclusion. But the section begins as follows. While Israel was staying at Shittim, the people, and in this case, yes, the people, is the word ha'am, the people profaned themselves by whoring with the Moabite women who invited the people to the sacrifices for their gods. The people partook of them and worshipped that God. Thus Israel attached itself to Baal Peor, and Adonai was incensed with Israel. Adonai said to Moses, "Take all the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before Adonai, so that Adonai's wrath may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to Israel's officials, "Each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor." Just then, one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moses and of the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, and taking a spear in his hand, he followed the Israelite into the chamber and stabbed both of them, the Israelite and the woman, through the belly. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped. Those who died of the plague numbered 24,000. That is where last week's Parsha ends. Last week's Parsha ends with that account where this plague has come among the people, presumably because of these sexual liaisons and accompanying idolatry, worship of another god, and the call from God to kill those who participated, and then this flagrant act by one, and then Pinchas comes and slays those two. And then this week, the account continues. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned away my anger from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Say, therefore, Hineni noten lo et briti shalom. I grant him my covenant of shalom, my covenant of peace. It shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites. So I find this troubling because of the call to violence. Now, the Torah, on the one hand, makes it clear that in doing this, he presumably saves many lives from this plague. He puts an end to the plague. And then God says this Brit Shalom. I give this Brit Shalom. I give him this Brit Shalom, this covenant of peace. What gives me a little comfort is the tradition around this text, because as many of you know, the Torah only has consonants. The Torah has no vowels and no punctuation. It's just a string of consonants and spaces. But there are traditions built into the text. There are traditions about how the text is to be written, in different ways it is to be written. Sometimes there's dots placed over letters. Sometimes, like one place, there's two upside down nuns used as parentheses. In this case, the tradition is that the vav in the word shalom is broken. The shalom is broken. The vav inside the shalom is broken. There is something broken about this covenant of peace. And that's the one thing that gives me comfort. It's the oral tradition which tells us that the written tradition is to be recorded in this way. And by the way, I do believe ultimately the written tradition that we have and the oral tradition around it are very much interconnected with each other. From a Jewish perspective, you cannot look at the written Torah and try to understand it without also taking into account the oral tradition, which gets ultimately recorded in Mishnah and Talmud, but also is ongoing. We either think of that in an orthodox way, which is to say the written tradition is kind of the notes to the lecture, and the oral tradition is the explanation of the lecture that gets passed down with it. Or you look at it in a modernistic way, which is to say that all of this tradition it originates as an oral tradition one way or another, and slowly parts of it get written down. One way or another, the oral tradition and the written tradition are interconnected with each other. And one of the differences between that comes up in Jewish-Christian dialogue, one of the differences between Judaism and Christianity is that Christianity took from us the written tradition, the scriptures, but did not bring along with it our oral tradition. They put another oral tradition onto our written tradition. But getting back to this broken covenant of peace, in our calendar, on the Jewish calendar, we are now in the beginning of a 3-week period, which is about brokenness. There's a 3-week period which begins with the 17th of Tammuz, which traditionally is a fast day. That was actually Sunday. And it concludes with the 9th of Av, which is in a couple weeks, the 9th day of Av, which is also a fast day. The 9th of Av is the anniversary of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, both in 586 BCE and in 70 CE, the first by the Babylonians and the second time by the Romans. That's the 9th of Av. The 17th of Tammuz, which was this past Sunday, is the anniversary of the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem by the Babylonians 3 weeks before the destruction in 586 BCE. So we're in the midst of this 3-week period about brokenness, because we're commemorating the destruction of the temple, and the destruction of the temple equates to brokenness in our tradition. Both times the temple was destroyed, it was accompanied by physical exile from the land, whether to Babylonia or into other parts of the Roman Empire in 70. It is also understood to be about spiritual exile. something about the connection between us and God is broken. And this is brought to understand as well. It's brought to symbolize all the things that continue to separate us from God and from each other. Tradition teaches that one of the reasons the temple was destroyed was because of sinat chinam, needless, baseless hatred of each other. The destruction of the temple and its accompanying exile, both physically and spiritually, represents the brokenness in the world and represents war and destruction and all the ways we hurt each other. It represents ignoring the evidence of climate change, even as temperatures in London reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and water in the Western United States drop to lower levels than ever before. It also represents violence done in the name of goodness and truth. And yes, we see violence done in the name of goodness and truth. In Jewish tradition, the cessation of sacrifices, which accompanies the temple destruction, symbolizes a lowering of the connection of God between us, because of the connection between us and God. Because when the temple was destroyed, sacrifices also stopped. And the sacrifices represented a link. Even as the smoke rose up from the sacrifices to heaven, that was seen as our prayers rising up. I myself am a vegetarian, but I once knew a teacher who said that about sacrifices. He felt that anything that brought sanctity to a barbecue was fine with him. So this idea that this reach nichoach, this pleasing fragrance rising up to heaven was a prayer. Already though, Maimonides who lived in the 1100s, in his works, his philosophical works, he suggested, and this is 1,000 years after the sacrifices were stopped, he suggested that sacrifices were an ancient, more primitive form of worship that could be substituted by something else for people spiritually more mature. That is, Maimonides, 1,000 years ago, already was writing that the sacrifices were a mode of prayer for people of an earlier time who needed more physical expression of prayer. And that perhaps we could see ourselves as something as spiritually more mature. Although that does raise the question, of course, as to whether we are really spiritually more mature than our ancient ancestors. We are certainly more advanced technologically, but are we more advanced in any other way? Are we spiritually more advanced? That is, in my mind, an open question. But substitutions that were implemented for the sacrifices included prayer, such as the recitation of the Amidah, which we did. The recitation of the Amidah is timed for the timing of the sacrifices. And the substitution of prayer for sacrifices is reinforced by verses such as in Psalms, Psalms 141, where we read, "Take my prayer as an offering of incense, and my upraised hands as an evening sacrifice." Substitutions for sacrifices also included deeds of loving kindness. Deeds of loving kindness, such as how we use the energies of our life force and offer our energies up for good in acts of prayer. Fasting sometimes becomes seen as a substitution for sacrifices. We're burning off the fat on our bodies instead of burning the fat of a sacrifice. And study and recitation. Study of the sacrificial ritual or recitation of the Torah text which describes the sacrifices. And in fact, the sections of Torah which describe the calendar of sacrifices that is most often taken and put into the prayer book as a substitute for the sacrifices, or that is read from the Torah at times of holidays. The section of Torah which describes those sacrifices is also found in this Torah portion. At each holiday and on Shabbat, the section of the Siddur or the selection of the Maftir Torah reading, which describes the sacrifice offered for that moment, it's taken from this Parsha. It's interesting to note that the adjustment we make to respond to the brokenness noted at the beginning of this Parsha is provided with the selection of Torah reading found at the end of the Parsha. So in this Parsha, we have both the brokenness, which is the problem, and some type of mechanism for adapting to the new situation. We find something in this Torah portion that symbolizes wholeness and healing, immediately following a selection of the Torah, which symbolizes brokenness. This sort of ritual accommodation is important because ritual does help shape our inner life, the life of our mind and heart, and help shape whatever impacts our inner life impacts how we participate in our outer life. And whatever happens outside of ourselves, around us, impacts our inner life. So ritual life is important in the way it impacts us. And as for how we should strive to shape our inner spiritual life, we find a clue in this Parsha as well. Pinchas responds to a spiritual and communal crisis with violence. The peace or calm which results leads to the Brit Shalom, the covenant, the broken covenant of peace, or the covenant of broken peace, which we have discussed. Moses, on the other hand, in the middle of the Parsha, confronts yet another conflict, a conflict faced by the daughters of a man named Zelophehad. Zelophehad is a man who dies with no sons, ultimately to inherit his allotment of land. Zelophehad will be given an allotment, but his sons, he has no sons, so there's no one to inherit his land. But he does have daughters. So the daughters approach Moses in the middle of this Parsha and ask, why can't we, the daughters, inherit? Why only sons? And Moses' answer, in effect, is, I don't know. I don't know. So he brings the question before God, and he receives an answer that the daughters should be allowed to inherit. Moses' approach is an approach of humility. He realizes he does not know all of Torah, and he inquires of God in a deliberative fashion. Pinchas' approach is not one of humility. He feels that he knows God's will with great assurance and confidence. And even though the result accompanies a cessation of the plague confronting the people, his response is seen, his violent response is seen in a very mixed way by tradition. Pinchas is praised for his zeal, but at the same time, the vav in the word shalom, as written in the Torah, is broken. The Torah tradition is indicating to us that something here is not whole. The violence is suspect. I will go further. Would we want God really to be calling for the impaling of people in this way? This is really why it is so important that Jewish tradition takes the Torah text as the first word, not the last word. The Torah is the first word, not the last word, because the last word goes again to the oral tradition. The oral tradition takes the Torah text and interprets it for use today. The oral tradition says, God gave us wheat for bread, reeds for linen, flax for linen, and Torah text for meaning. We could choose to chomp on raw grains instead of eating bread. We could choose to try to wear reeds instead of weaving them into linen. And we could choose to live by the raw words of the Torah text, or we could use our God-given mind to derive meaning from it with our oral tradition. The Torah is the first word, not the last word. And the tradition makes clear that just because Moses is told to do something in the Torah, that does not mean we are told to do it. Moses in the Torah is portrayed as often arguing with God. Moses often argues with God as well as with the people. To the people, Moses is always arguing for faithfulness, righteousness, and obedience. To God, Moses is almost always arguing for compassion, mercy, and forgiveness. Moses is keeping a balance in his religious teaching between love of Torah that leads to strict application of righteousness on the one hand, and love of the people of Israel, which leads to generous application of forgiveness. And this balance between love of Torah on the one hand and love of the people of Israel on the other hand, this balance between the call for righteousness and the call for forgiveness, this is a balance we all should strive for, and perhaps is the best reason that this tradition is called Torat Moshe, the Torah of Moses. And maybe that is why, and I'm speculating here, that in traditional ritual practice of the reading of the Torah, the beginning of this Torah is read, the beginning of this section is read last week, and the end is read this week. Because in the middle, just after the reading of the actual, just after last week's reading of that violent act, we read a Haftorah, which was last week, a reading from the prophets, which comes from the book of Micah. The Haftorah that is read after reading that violent account ends with the words, "It has been told to you, O human, what is good, and what Adonai requires of you, but to do justice, to love compassion, and to walk humbly with your God." From Micah. I interpret walking humbly to mean understanding that you do not know everything. Be humble, not arrogant in your religious truth claims. For it is whenever people forget that humility, and embrace their own understandings of truth with arrogance, that they end up doing violence in the name of truth and goodness. Shabbat Shalom.